The black twins took a surprise DNA test. When the doctor saw the result, he shouted, "Get a lawyer now!" The Sunday afternoon sun filtered through the shutters of the apartment shared by Marcus and Malik Johnson. The 28-year-old African-American twins were sitting quietly in the living room, each absorbed in their own thoughts. Marcus, the older by only 3 minutes, drummed his fingers nervously on the coffee table, while Malik adjusted and readjusted the tie he would wear to court on Monday. The air was filled with anticipation and apprehension. They had decided to take a DNA test weeks ago, driven by a curiosity that had plagued them since they were teenagers. Questions about their origins, always present but rarely discussed, finally led them to seek concrete answers. "Do you think the results will arrive today?" Marcus asked, breaking the silence. Malik shrugged, trying to look unconcerned. "Maybe. Dr. Carter said it would take about 2 weeks. At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of his name, the phone rang. The caller ID showed the number of Dr. Carter's office. The brothers exchanged tense glances before Marcus answered. "Hello?" His voice shook slightly. "Marcus? This is Dr. Carter. The results of the DNA test are back. I need you and Malik to come to my office immediately. It's urgent." The serious tone in the doctor's voice made Marcus's heart race. "Has something happened, doctor?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We'd better discuss this in person. Please come as soon as possible." 15 minutes later, the twins were sitting in the office of Dr. Carter, a middle-aged man with kind eyes hidden behind thin-framed glasses. He watched them with an expression that mixed concern and something that seemed to be guilt. "Marcus Malik," he began, choosing his words carefully. "The results of the DNA test revealed something unexpected, something that, frankly, took me by surprise and raises serious questions about the circumstances of your birth." Malik leaned forward, his lawyerly posture emerging instinctively. "What exactly are we talking about, doctor?" Dr. Carter took a deep breath. "Your genetic markers don't match the records we have of your alleged biological parents. In fact, there is no match at all." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Malik, on the other hand, was already analyzing the legal implications. "What does that mean, exactly?" Malik asked, his voice tense. The doctor removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It means that you are not biologically related to the people you believe to be your parents. And there's more. The medical records I have here, well, they seem to have been falsified." Marcus finally found his voice. "Falsified? But how? Why?" "I don't have all the answers," Dr. Carter admitted. "But what I can say is that it raises serious questions about the circumstances of your adoption, and that's why my advice is, get a lawyer now." The twins left the office in a state of shock, walking through the familiar streets of their neighborhood as if they were strangers in an unfamiliar land. Every face that passed them seemed to hide a secret. Every building seemed to hold a hidden truth about their origins. "We need to talk to Mom and Dad," Marcus finally said, his voice breaking. Malik nodded, but his mind was already working in another direction. "Yes, but first, we need a lawyer. Someone who isn't me and who can look at this objectively." That evening, after a tense call to their adoptive parents asking for an urgent meeting, the brothers met with Sarah Goldstein, a lawyer specializing in family law. Her office was welcoming, with walls covered in diplomas and photos of smiling families, a cruel contrast to the emotional turmoil the twins were facing. "Based on what you've told me," Sarah began, her piercing blue eyes focused on the brothers, "it looks like we're dealing with a case of irregular, possibly illegal adoption. The first step is to get all the records from the adoption agency responsible for your case." Malik nodded, his professional instincts momentarily overcoming his emotional shock. What if they refused to cooperate? Sarah smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Then we file a lawsuit. They'll have to produce the documents in court. The next few days passed in a blur of emotions and legal action. The conversation with her adoptive parents was painful. Between tears and pleas, they insisted that they knew of no wrongdoing, that they had adopted the twins in good faith through a reputable agency. "We love you," their adoptive mother sobbed, clutching her children's hands. "You are our children, no matter what that test says." But for Marcus and Malik, the world they knew was falling apart. Every childhood memory, every family moment was now tainted by the shadow of doubt and deceit. The adoption agency, when confronted, erected a wall of silence and bureaucracy. "All our files are confidential," was the cold reply they received. "We can't release information without a court order." Sarah kept her promise, filing a lawsuit to force the agency to reveal the records. The legal battle that followed was intense and exhausting. With each new hearing, with each new document revealed, more questions arose. It was during one of these hearings that the truth began to emerge. A former employee of the agency, driven by guilt and a desire to do the right thing, came forward with bombshell information. The agency was involved in a baby trafficking scheme, he revealed, his voice shaking. Children were taken from vulnerable mothers, often without consent, and sold to families who could afford it. The revelation dropped like a bombshell in court. Marcus felt his stomach churn as Malik clenched his fists so hard that his fingernails left marks on his palms. As more details came to light, it became clear that the Johnson twins case was just the tip of the iceberg. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of other families could have been affected by this criminal scheme. The judge, a man with a stern expression and compassionate eyes, looked directly at Marcus and Malik at the end of that tumultuous session. "Young people," he said, his voice laden with restrained emotion, "what has been done to you and so many others is an injustice that cries out for redress. This court will do everything in its power to ensure that the truth comes out and that justice is done." As they left the courthouse that day, Marcus and Malik found themselves at the epicenter of a storm that threatened not only to redefine their personal identities, but also to expose a web of corruption and crime that extended far beyond their individual lives. "What do we do now?" Marcus asked, his voice a tired whisper. Malik looked at his brother, his eyes reflecting a mixture of determination and fear. "We keep fighting, for the truth, for justice, and for all the other families who may be in the same situation as us." As they walked home, the weight of their new reality weighed heavily on their shoulders. But along with the weight, there was also a spark of hope, the hope that, through this painful journey, they would not only discover the truth about their origins, but also help correct a deeply flawed system. The sun was setting over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. For Marcus and Malik Johnson, it was the end of a life they knew and the beginning of a journey into the unknown, a journey that promised to be as challenging as it was life-changing. Autumn painted the streets of Boston in shades of red and gold, but for Marcus and Malik Johnson, the world seemed to have lost its colors. Weeks had passed since the shocking revelation about their origins, and each day brought new discoveries that shook the foundations of their identities. On a cold October afternoon, the twins met at Sarah Goldstein's office. The lawyer welcomed them with a tired smile, piles of documents spread out on her mahogany desk. "We have news," Sarah announced, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. "We've managed to trace some of your biological relatives." Marcus felt his heart race. "Who?" he asked. his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah picked up a folder and opened it carefully. Your maternal grandmother, Evelyn Thompson. She lives in a nursing home in Chicago. Malik leaned forward, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. Does she know about us? The lawyer shook her head. No, as far as we can determine. In fact, it seems she never knew that her daughter had twins. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Marcus closed his eyes, trying to imagine the face of a grandmother he had never met. Malik, for his part, was already planning his next steps. We need to go to her, Malik declared, his voice firm. She might have the answers we're looking for. Sarah nodded, but her gaze was wary. There's something else you need to know, she said softly. Evelyn is very ill. The doctors don't think she has much time left. The news hit the twins like a punch in the gut. The possibility of losing a connection they barely knew existed was devastating. How long? Marcus asked, his voice breaking. Weeks, maybe days, Sarah replied, the compassion evident in her voice. That night, while packing for a hurried trip to Chicago, the siblings barely exchanged words. The apartment was immersed in a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional sigh or the sound of clothes being folded. What are we going to tell her? Marcus finally asked, sitting on the edge of his bed, a half-folded shirt in his hands. Malik stopped packing his suitcase, turning to face his brother. The truth, he answered simply. She deserves to know. We deserve to know. The flight to Chicago the next morning was a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. Every kilometer brought them closer to a part of their history that they had hitherto been unaware of, a piece of the puzzle of their lives that could finally begin to form a complete picture. The nursing home was a red brick building surrounded by a well-kept garden. Autumn leaves danced in the air, falling gently to the ground. Marcus and Malik stopped at the entrance, exchanging nervous glances before finally entering. The receptionist guided them through silent corridors until they came to a door at the end of a long hallway. This is it, she said softly. Room 205. Heart pounding, Marcus knocked on the door. A faint voice answered from inside. Come in. The room was small, but cozy. Old photos decorated the walls and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. On the bed, an elderly woman watched them with curious eyes. Her white hair framed a face marked by time, but her eyes were lively and penetrating, the same shade of brown that the twins saw every day in the mirror. Hello, she said, her voice weak but warm. Can I help you? Marcus took a step forward, feeling like he was about to jump off a cliff. Mrs. Thompson, Evelyn, we are Marcus and Malik Johnson, and we believe we are your grandchildren. The silence that followed seemed eternal. Evelyn stared at them, her eyes wide with surprise and confusion. Then slowly, tears began to form in her eyes. My God, she whispered. You look so much like her. Her? Malik asked gently. My Sarah, Evelyn replied, her voice trembling with emotion. My daughter, your mother. In the moments that followed, a flood of emotions and stories were shared. Evelyn told of her daughter Sarah, a bright young woman full of dreams who mysteriously disappeared almost 30 years ago. She was pregnant, Evelyn revealed, her wrinkled hands clasping those of the twins. But I never knew they were twins. She never came home. Marcus and Malik listened, fascinated and horrified as Evelyn told of years of fruitless searching, of dashed hopes and broken hearts. I never gave up, she said, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. Every day, I prayed that one day I would know what happened to my little girl and the baby she was carrying. As the afternoon progressed, the twins shared their own story. The recent discovery about their adoption, the ongoing legal battle, the desperate search for answers. Evelyn listened attentively, occasionally wiping away a tear. "You're so brave," she finally said, her gaze full of pride. "Sarah would be so proud of you." As the sun began to set, painting the room in golden hues, Evelyn asked to see some photos. Marcus took his phone out of his pocket, showing images of them growing up, their formations, happy moments with their adoptive parents. "They seem like wonderful people," Evelyn commented, looking at a picture of the Johnson family together. Malik nodded, feeling a wave of guilt. "They are. They love us very much." "You can never have too much love," Evelyn said softly. "You're lucky to have so many people who love you." When it was time to leave, the twins' hearts were heavy. Evelyn's fragile condition was evident, and the fear that this might be the only time they would see her hung over them. "We'll come back tomorrow," Marcus promised, holding his grandmother's hand. Evelyn smiled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I'll be waiting. There's still so much to share, so many stories to tell." As they left the nursing home, the weight of discovery and the urgency of time pressed down on them. The newfound connection was precious, but fragile. "We need to find out what happened to our mother," Malik said, his voice determined. "For Evelyn, for ourselves." Marcus nodded, feeling a new determination growing inside him. "Yes, and we need to do it quickly. Evelyn deserves to know the truth before." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The brothers exchanged a look of mutual understanding. The race against time had begun, and the answers they sought seemed to be within reach, hidden in the shadows of the past. As they walked back to the hotel, the Chicago sky darkened, the first stars beginning to shine. For Marcus and Malik, these stars seemed like a symbol of hope, points of light guiding them through the darkness of their unknown past, towards a future where the truth, however painful, would finally come out. Winter arrived in Boston, bringing with it a biting cold and a sense of urgency that infiltrated every aspect of Marcus and Malik Johnson's lives. The revelations about their origins and the emotional encounter with their grandmother Evelyn had triggered a series of events that threatened to crumble the twins' carefully constructed world. On a freezing December morning, Malik Johnson walked through the glass doors of the prestigious law firm where he had worked for 5 years. The air in the lobby was heavy with furtive glances and barely concealed whispers. He felt the weight of these stares as he walked towards his office, his leather briefcase pressed against his chest like a shield. Before he could reach the safety of his office, the voice of Jennifer, his assistant, reached him. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Hartley wants to see you right away." Malik closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. He knew this moment would come, but the reality was much more frightening than he had imagined. With determined steps, he made his way to the office of Richard Hartley, Malik's senior partner and mentor for the last few years. Hartley was standing by the window, watching the city below. When Malik entered, he turned slowly, his face a mask of disappointment and concern. "Malik," he began, his voice deep. "Did you see the papers this morning?" Without waiting for an answer, Hartley threw a newspaper on the table. The headline screamed, "Promising Lawyer at Center of Illegal Adoption Scandal." Malik felt his blood run cold in his veins. "Richard, I can explain." "Explain what, Malik?" Hartley interrupted, his voice rising. "Explain how you kept this from us, how you allowed this firm to be dragged into this media circus." The words hit Malik like physical blows. He struggled to keep his composure, years of legal training coming into play. "I haven't hidden anything, Richard. I only recently found out about the circumstances of my adoption myself. I'm just as shocked as everyone else." Hartley sighed heavily, collapsing into his chair. "Malik, you're one of our best. We had big plans for you, but this changes everything." "What do you mean?" Malik asked, even though he already knew the answer. "We're putting you on administrative leave," Hartley said, avoiding Malik's gaze. "Until this is resolved, we can't risk the firm's reputation." Malik felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. His entire career, everything he had worked so hard for, was crumbling before his eyes. "For how long?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Hartley shook his head. "We don't know. It depends on how this plays out. Malik, I'm sorry." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Marcus Johnson was facing his own dilemmas. In his classroom at Boston High School, he was trying to concentrate on the history lesson he was teaching, but his mind kept going back to the conversation he'd had with Lisa the night before. "I'm pregnant, Marcus," Lisa had said, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. The news should have been cause for celebration, the start of a new chapter in their lives. But with everything that was happening, Marcus felt torn, pulled in 1,000 different directions. The sound of the bell announcing the end of class brought him back to the present. As the students left, chatting animatedly, Marcus remained seated at his desk, his head between his hands. "Professor Johnson?" A soft voice made him raise his head. It was Emily, one of his most dedicated students. "Is everything all right?" Marcus forced a smile. "Yes, Emily. Just a bit tired." Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking again. We saw the news about you and your brother. I just wanted to say that we're all rooting for you." The sincerity in the young woman's voice almost broke through Marcus's carefully constructed defenses. He nodded, unable to speak, and Emily quietly left the room. That evening, Marcus and Malik found themselves in their shared apartment, both carrying the weight of their difficult days. "They put me on leave," Malik said, his voice laden with bitterness. "Everything I've worked for." Marcus put a comforting hand on his brother's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Malik. That's not fair." "What about you?" Malik asked, noticing the troubled expression on his brother's face. Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. "Lisa's pregnant." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. "That's amazing," Malik finally said, trying to sound excited. "It is," Marcus agreed, but his voice was far from enthusiastic. "But with all this going on, Malik, how can I think about starting a family when I don't even know who I really am?" The words hung in the air, giving voice to the fears and doubts they had both been carrying. "We'll find out," Malik said firmly, squeezing his brother's shoulder. "Together." In the days that followed, Marcus and Malik found themselves navigating a minefield of emotions and difficult decisions. Malik struggled with the sense of betrayal from his co-workers, while trying to maintain his determination to uncover the truth about his origins. Marcus, for his part, was torn between the desire to build a future with Lisa and the baby, and the desperate need to understand his past. Every ultrasound, every plan for the future, was accompanied by a sense of guilt and inadequacy. The pressure from the media increased every day. Reporters followed them, shouting questions about their adoption, about the developing scandal. The privacy they had once taken for granted now seemed a distant luxury. One evening, while the brothers were sitting quietly in the living room, the phone rang. It was Sarah Goldstein, their lawyer. "We have a lead on your birth mother," she said, her voice tense with excitement. "A former employee of the adoption agency is willing to talk. He says he knows what happened to her." The news dropped like a bombshell in the small apartment. Marcus and Malik looked at each other, a mixture of hope and fear in their eyes. "When can we find him?" Malik asked, his voice trembling slightly. "Tomorrow," Sarah replied. "He only agreed to talk once. We have to take this chance." As they hung up the phone, the siblings found themselves on the brink of yet another turning point in their already tumultuous lives. The promise of answers was within reach, but with it came the fear of what those answers might reveal. "What do we do if it's something terrible?" Marcus asked, giving voice to the fears they both shared. Malik looked at his brother, his eyes reflecting a fierce determination. "We'll face it together, as we always have." That night, as the city slept around them, Marcus and Malik stayed awake, each lost in their own thoughts. The future, once so clear and promising, now seemed a hazy and uncertain path. But amid the uncertainty, one thing remained constant: the unshakable bond between the brothers. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, united by blood, shared history, and a love that transcended the circumstances of their birth. As the first rays of sunlight began to seep through the windows, Marcus and Malik prepared themselves for another day of revelations and challenges. The road ahead was daunting, but they were determined to walk it no matter the cost. The winter in Boston had become harsher, reflecting the emotional turmoil that Marcus and Malik Johnson were facing. The snow fell silently outside the window of the apartment they shared, creating a white, silent world that contrasted sharply with the brothers' inner turmoil. Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, as he leafed through an old photo album. Each image now seemed charged with new meaning, with unanswered questions. He stopped at a photo of his 10th birthday, his young face beaming with happiness next to his adoptive parents. "Who am I really?" he muttered to himself, tracing the outline of his younger face with his finger. Across the room, Malik watched his brother in silence, feeling the weight of the same question. Since the revelation about his adoption and meeting Evelyn, they had both been plunged into a deep identity crisis. "I've been thinking," Malik began, breaking the silence, "about everything we've learned about our African American heritage over the years, about the struggles, the achievements, the culture, and now it's like it's all a lie." Marcus looked up from the album, meeting his brother's gaze. "It's not a lie, Malik. It's part of who we are, how we were created. But now there are more questions than answers." Malik moved closer, taking a seat next to his brother. "Have you ever wondered if our biological mother was really African American? If we have other origins that we can't even imagine?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Marcus closed the photo album, feeling a wave of conflicting emotions. "Sometimes I feel like I'm betraying Mom and Dad just by thinking about it. They raised us. They loved us. But we can't deny that there's a part of us that's always been missing," Malik added softly. Just then, Marcus's phone rang, breaking the tension of the moment. It was Lisa. "Marcus," her voice sounded worried, "you need to see this. Turn on the TV, Channel 5. With a worried look at Malik, Marcus turned on the television. What they saw stunned them. A reporter was standing in front of Boston High School where Marcus taught. Sources claim that Professor Marcus Johnson, embroiled in the recent illegal adoption scandal, may have obtained his teaching position under false pretenses. School officials are investigating the authenticity of his documents. Marcus turned off the TV, feeling nauseous. "This can't be happening," he muttered, sinking onto the sofa. Malik put a comforting hand on his brother's shoulder. "Let's face it, Marcus. Together." In the days that followed, the Johnson brothers' lives became a whirlwind of emotions and challenges. Marcus was placed on administrative leave by the school, pending an investigation. Malik, already away from his job at the law firm, plunged headlong into the search for answers about his origins. It was during this tumultuous period that something unexpected happened. The Johnson brothers' story began to gain attention not only from the tabloid media, but also from adoption support groups and children's rights activists. One afternoon, while Marcus was walking around the neighborhood, trying to escape the suffocating confines of his apartment, he came across a surprising scene. A group of people were gathered in front of the town hall, carrying placards and banners. As he approached, he could read the messages. Justice for the Johnson brothers. Transparency in adoptions now. Everyone deserves to know their origins. Marcus stood paralyzed, watching the scene with a mixture of shock and emotion. A young woman approached him, offering a pamphlet. "We're organizing a support group for people who have been through similar situations," she explained, her gaze full of compassion. "You're not alone in this struggle." That evening, Marcus shared his experience with Malik. The brothers, who had felt so isolated in their search, suddenly found themselves at the center of a larger movement. "It's incredible," Malik reflected, leafing through the flyer. "How many other people must be going through the same thing as us?" The discovery of community support brought a new perspective to the Johnson brothers. They began attending support group meetings, sharing their experiences and listening to the stories of other adoptees in search of their origins. It was during one of these meetings that Marcus found the strength to face one of his biggest internal struggles. In front of a group of strangers who quickly became allies, he shared, "All my life, I've been proud of my African American heritage. I've studied our history, our culture. I've taught about the struggles and achievements of our people. And now, I don't know who I am anymore." An elderly woman, her eyes full of wisdom and understanding, held Marcus's hand. "My dear, your identity is not defined by your DNA alone. It is formed by your experiences, your struggles, your loves. You are no less authentic for not knowing all the pieces of your puzzle." The words touched Marcus deeply, echoing in his mind in the days that followed. He began to see his journey not as a denial of who he was, but as an expansion, an opportunity to embrace all facets of his identity. Meanwhile, Malik channeled his energy into turning his personal struggle into a greater cause. He began working with civil rights lawyers, seeking changes to adoption laws to ensure greater transparency and protection for children and families. The Johnson brothers' story continued to gain attention. Journalists, activists, and politicians began to take an interest in the case, seeing it as a symbol of a larger issue affecting countless families. One evening, as the brothers watched a report about their case on television, Malik turned to Marcus, his eyes shining with a new determination. "Do you realize what's happening, Marcus? Our story. It's not just ours anymore. We're giving a voice to so many other people who have gone through this in silence." Marcus nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and responsibility. "It's scary, but at the same time, I feel like we're finally making a difference." As winter gave way to spring, Marcus and Malik Johnson found themselves at the center of a growing movement. Their lives, once defined by the search for their personal origins, were now intertwined with a larger struggle for justice and truth. The journey was far from over. There were still many unanswered questions, many challenges to face. But for the first time since the truth about their adoption came to light, the brothers felt that they were not alone. They had found a community, a cause, and with it, a new sense of purpose. As they prepared for another day of interviews, meetings, and research, Marcus and Malik exchanged a look of mutual understanding. No matter what the future held, they would face it together, strengthened not only by their blood bond, but by the support of a community that had gathered around them, united in the search for truth and justice. Spring in Boston brought with it not only the blooming of flowers, but also a series of revelations that promised to change the course of the Johnson brothers' lives forever. Lawyer Sarah Goldstein's office was buzzing with activity on that sunny April morning, the air charged with a mixture of tension and anticipation. Marcus and Malik arrived early, their faces reflecting a mixture of anxiety and determination. Sarah greeted them with a tired smile, but her eyes shone with an intensity that the brothers had learned to recognize as a sign of good news. "Sit down, boys," she said, gesturing to the chairs in front of her table. "We have a lot to discuss." As the brothers settled down, Sarah opened a thick folder on the table. "Over the last few weeks, our team has been working tirelessly, following up every lead, every crumb of information, and we finally have something concrete." Malik leaned forward, his posture tense. "What did you find, Sarah?" The lawyer took a document from her briefcase, her eyes scanning the lines as she spoke. "We gained access to some confidential files from the adoption agency, and what we found, well, it's shocking, to say the least." Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach. "How bad is it?" Sarah looked up, her gaze serious. "We're talking about a network of corruption and child trafficking that stretches back decades. The agency wasn't just negligent, it was criminal." The words hung in the air, heavy and threatening. Malik was the first to break the silence. How did that work?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "From what we could find out, the agency had connections with hospitals and clinics all over the country. They specifically targeted young and vulnerable mothers, often from ethnic minorities or in difficult socio-economic situations." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling a wave of nausea. "Our mother?" "Yes," Sarah confirmed softly. "We believe that your biological mother, Sarah Thompson, was one of the victims of this scheme." Malik stood up abruptly, unable to contain his agitation. He walked over to the window, staring out at the city outside, so oblivious to the whirlwind of emotions that was consuming him. How could they? How did no one notice for so long? Sarah shook her head sadly. Money, influence, and a system that often fails to protect the most vulnerable. But now, with this evidence, we can finally expose it all. Marcus, who had remained silent, absorbing the information, finally spoke. "What about the other families? There must be hundreds." "Thousands," Sarah corrected gently. "And that's why we need to act carefully. What we have here isn't just your case, Marcus and Malik. It's potentially one of the biggest adoption scandals in the history of the country." The brothers exchanged glances, the weight of responsibility falling on their shoulders. It was no longer just about them, about their personal quest. It was about all the families that had been torn apart, all the lives that had been irrevocably altered by this criminal scheme. "What do we do now?" Malik asked, his voice laden with determination. Sarah stood up, walking over to a whiteboard on the wall of her office. "First, we need to build a solid case. That means more investigation, more evidence. We'll need statements from former employees, medical records, anything that can corroborate what we've discovered." As Sarah sketched out a plan of action on the board, Marcus felt a sudden wave of emotion hit him. Silent tears began to stream down his face. Malik, noticing his brother's state, put a hand on his shoulder. "Hey, we're in this together, remember?" Marcus nodded, wiping away the tears. "It's just that I think of our mother, how she must have felt, and all the other mothers who've been through this." Sarah stopped her sketch, turning to the siblings with a look of compassion. "What you're feeling is completely valid. This isn't just a legal battle, it's an emotional journey, and I promise you, we will get justice not just for you, but for everyone affected by this terrible scheme." In the days that followed, Marcus and Malik found themselves at the center of a whirlwind of activity. Interviews with former agency officials, meetings with other affected families, endless hours reviewing documents and records. One afternoon, while going through some files at home, Malik came across something that made his heart stop. "Marcus," he called out, his voice shaking slightly, "I think I've found something about our mother." Marcus approached quickly, looking over his brother's shoulder. It was a medical record dating from shortly before their birth. On it, there was a handwritten note, "Resistant patient. Consider extra measures." The brothers exchanged horrified glances. "She fought," Marcus whispered. "She tried to keep us." That discovery brought a new wave of emotions. Anger at the injustice they had suffered, sadness for the mother they had never met, and a renewed determination to expose the truth. As the case gained momentum, more people began to speak out. Former nurses, social workers, even a retired doctor who could no longer live with the weight of guilt. Each new testimony, each piece of evidence, painted a clearer and more disturbing picture of the criminal scheme. One evening, while the brothers were working late in Sarah's office, going through yet another pile of documents, Malik came across something that made his blood run cold. "Marcus," he called out, his voice a mixture of shock and anger. "Look at this." It was an internal memo from the adoption agency, dated a few days after the twins' birth. In it, there were explicit instructions to separate the babies, placing them in different families to maximize profit. "They were going to separate us," Marcus whispered, horrified. "If it hadn't been for—" "Our parents," Malik added, suddenly remembering the story his adoptive parents had told him so many times. How they had insisted on adopting both twins, refusing to separate them. At that moment, a wave of gratitude for the parents who raised them flooded over the brothers. Despite the lies and secrets, the love and determination of their adoptive parents had kept them together. Sarah, who had been watching the scene in silence, finally spoke up. "This, gentleman, may be the final piece we needed. It proves not just negligence but criminal intent." As the evening progressed, the Johnson brothers found themselves on the verge of a monumental turning point in their case. The evidence they had uncovered not only shed light on their own story, but threatened to expose decades of criminal practices that had affected thousands of lives. Exhausted but determined, Marcus and Malik left the office in the early hours of the morning. As they walked through the silent streets of Boston, the sky beginning to lighten with the first rays of the sun, they felt the weight of what was to come. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, looking at his brother. Malik nodded, his expression a mixture of determination and apprehension. "There's no turning back now. We need to see this through to the end." As the sun rose over the city, illuminating the skyscrapers and historic streets, the Johnson brothers prepared for the next chapter of their fight, a struggle that had begun as a personal quest for identity, but had now turned into a crusade for justice that would echo for generations. Summer arrived in Boston with a wave of stifling heat, but for Marcus and Malik Johnson, the real warmth came from within. The revelations of the last few months had lit a fire in their souls, a mixture of anger, determination, and, surprisingly, hope. That July morning, the brothers found themselves in the hospital room of Evelyn Thompson, their recently discovered grandmother. The air conditioning hummed softly, contrasting with the emotion-filled silence that filled the room. Evelyn, frail but with eyes sparkling with life, held her grandchildren's hands. Her voice, though weak, carried the weight of decades of repressed love. "My boys," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "I never thought I'd live to see this day." Marcus felt a lump in his throat, struggling to hold back his own tears. "Neither did we, Grandma," he replied softly. the word grandma still strange on his tongue, but strangely comforting. Malik, always the more composed of the two, found himself equally moved. "We have so much to tell you, so many questions." Evelyn smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the whole room. "And I have so many stories to share. About your mother, about the family you never knew." Over the next few hours, Evelyn unraveled the skein of her memories. She spoke of Sarah, the daughter she had lost so young, painting a vivid portrait of a young woman full of life and dreams. "She was like the two of you," Evelyn said, her eyes lost in distant memories. "Strong like you, Malik, and with Marcus's gentle heart. She would have been a wonderful mother." The pain of loss, still fresh after so many years, was palpable in her voice. Marcus and Malik exchanged glances, feeling the weight of the life that could have been, of the family that had been stolen from them. "What happened to her?" Malik asked softly, dreading the answer but needing to know. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. "She disappeared. One day she was here, overjoyed with her pregnancy, making plans for the future. The next day, she was gone, as if the earth had swallowed her up." The revelation struck the brothers like a thunderbolt. Malik felt a wave of anger rise in his chest. "It was the adoption agency," he said through clenched teeth. "They took her." Marcus put a hand on his brother's arm, a silent gesture of support and caution. "Grandma," he asked gently, "did you look for her?" A sob escaped Evelyn's lips. "Every day, for years. I went to the police. I hired private detectives. Nothing. It was as if she had never existed." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with decades of pain and unanswered questions. But there was also something else in the air, a sense of connection, of pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. "Grandma," Malik said softly, "we promised you. We're going to find out what happened. We'll get justice for Sarah, for our mother." Evelyn squeezed her grandchildren's hands, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and determination. "I know you will, my darlings. You are so like her, so strong, so determined." As the afternoon progressed, the conversation flowed more freely. Evelyn shared stories of Sarah's childhood, showing old photos she had kept all these years. Marcus and Malik, for their part, told about their lives, about the adoptive parents who raised them with love. "They seem like wonderful people," Evelyn said, looking at a photo of the Johnson family. "I'm grateful to them for taking such good care of you." The mention of their adoptive parents brought a new wave of emotions to the siblings. The guilt they had felt for searching for their biological origins, the fear of hurting the people who had raised them with so much love. "I think we need to talk to them," Marcus said, looking at Malik. "Tell them everything we've found out." Malik nodded, feeling the weight of the decision. They deserved to know the truth, all of it. That night, after leaving Evelyn to rest at the hospital, the Johnson brothers met on the porch of the house where they grew up. The air was heavy with summer heat and anticipation of what was to come. Mary and John Johnson, the adoptive parents who had raised them for almost 3 decades, were waiting for them in the living room. The silence was palpable, laden with unasked questions and unspoken truths. "Mom, Dad," Marcus began, his voice trembling slightly. "We have something important to tell you." Over the next few hours, Marcus and Malik unfolded the complex tapestry of their newfound history. They talked about the corrupt adoption agency, about Sarah Thompson, the mother they never knew, and about Evelyn, the grandmother they had just met. Mary cried silently, while John held her hand, his face a mask of shock and pain. "Why didn't you tell us before?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Malik felt a pang of guilt. "We were afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of hurting you, of you thinking we didn't love you." Mary stood up then, pulling her two sons into a tight embrace. "Oh, my boys," she sobbed. "We always knew this day would come. We always knew that you might want to know about your origins." John joined in the hug, his own tears finally falling. "We love you. Nothing will change that. You are our children, no matter what." At that moment, wrapped in the embrace of their adoptive parents, Marcus and Malik felt a wave of relief and love wash over them. The truth, as painful as it was, had finally been revealed, and the love of their adoptive family remained unwavering. When they finally parted, Mary looked at her children with determination in her eyes. "What can we do to help? How can we support you on this journey?" Marcus and Malik exchanged looks of surprise and gratitude. You want to help us?" Malik asked incredulously. John nodded firmly. "Of course we do. We're a family, and families stick together no matter what." That night, sitting in the living room of the house where they grew up, surrounded by the unconditional love of their adoptive parents, Marcus and Malik felt a profound change within themselves. The search for their origins, which had previously seemed to threaten the family ties they knew, now strengthened them in unexpected ways. As they planned the next steps in their investigation, now with the full support of Mary and John, the Johnson brothers found themselves filled with a new sense of purpose and belonging. They weren't just seeking answers about their past. They were forging a new future, one that encompassed every facet of who they were. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but now they knew they were not alone. With the love of two families, one by blood and one by choice, to support them, Marcus and Malik were ready to face any challenge that came their way. When they finally went to bed that night, exhausted but with full hearts, the brothers shared a look of mutual understanding. The journey they had begun in search of their origins had turned into something much bigger. It was a journey of reconciliation, of healing, and above all, of love. And while the Boston summer continued outside, warm and vibrant, inside the Johnsons' home, a new season of hope and family unity had begun. Autumn arrived in Boston with an explosion of color, the trees along the Charles River painted in shades of red, orange, and gold. For Marcus and Malik Johnson, this change of season seemed to reflect the transformation in their own lives. After months of intense investigation, painful revelations, and exciting reconciliations, they were on the brink of a discovery that promised to change everything. Sarah Goldstein's office was filled with tension that October morning. Marcus and Malik arrived early, accompanied by their adoptive parents, Mary and John, and by Evelyn, their biological grandmother, who had insisted on being present despite her failing health. Sarah welcomed them with a tired smile, but her eyes shone with an intensity that the brothers had learned to associate with great news. "Sit down, all of you," she said, gesturing to the chairs arranged in a semicircle in front of her table. "We have a special guest today." Before anyone could ask, the door opened and Dr. Carter walked in. The doctor who had started this whole journey months ago seemed to have aged years since the brothers had last seen him. His face was marked by worry lines and his eyes carried a weight that went beyond physical tiredness. "Dr. Carter," Malik asked, confused, "what's going on?" The doctor took a deep breath, looking at every face in the room before speaking. "Marcus, Malik, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago." The silence that followed was palpable, filled with anticipation and apprehension. Marcus felt his adoptive mother's hand squeeze his, a silent gesture of support. I'm your uncle," Dr. Carter finally said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Your biological mother's brother, Sarah." The revelation dropped like a bomb in the room. Evelyn let out a muffled scream, her hands shaking as she covered her mouth. Marcus and Malik were paralyzed, unable to process the information. How is that possible? Malik finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Carter, now revealed to be the twins' uncle, sank into a chair, the weight of decades of secrets finally bearing down on him. I was young when Sarah disappeared, just a medical student. By the time I realized what had happened, by the time I found out about the adoption agency and its corrupt practices, it was too late. Sarah was gone and you had already been adopted. Tears were flowing freely down Evelyn's face now. "Why didn't you ever tell me, David?" she asked, using Dr. Carter's first name for the first time. "I was afraid," he admitted, the shame evident in his voice. "Afraid of the people behind the agency, afraid of putting you in danger. So I watched from afar, became a doctor for the Johnson family without them knowing about the connection, just so I could keep an eye on you." Marcus felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, confusion, but also a strange sense of relief. "That's why you encouraged us to do the DNA test," he realized. Dr. Carter nodded. "I knew it was time for the truth to come out. I couldn't live with this secret any longer." Sarah Goldstein, who had been watching the scene in silence, finally intervened. "Dr. Carter's revelation is not only personal, it's legally significant," she explained. "As an insider and family witness, his testimony could be crucial to dismantling the entire network of illegal adoptions." The hours that followed were an emotional roller coaster. Dr. Carter shared everything he knew about Sarah's disappearance, about the corrupt practices of the adoption agency, and about his own internal struggle over the years. For Marcus and Malik, each new piece of information was like a piece of a complex puzzle finally falling into place. The picture that emerged was painful, but also liberating. "What happened to our mother?" Malik asked, the question that had haunted the brothers since the beginning of their journey. Dr. Carter closed his eyes as if reliving a painful memory. "She fought," he said softly. "She fought to keep you. When she realized what the agency was planning to do, she tried to escape, but they caught up with her." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Malik, always the more controlled of the two, couldn't hold back his tears. Evelyn couldn't finish the sentence, the fear of the answer evident in her eyes. Dr. Carter shook his head slowly. "I don't know. For years, I've tried to find her, but it's like she disappeared off the face of the earth." Sarah Goldstein snorted, drawing everyone's attention. "With Dr. Carter's information and the evidence we've gathered, we have a solid case, not just to expose the agency, but to start an official search for Sarah Thompson." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Testimonies were given, evidence presented, and the press soon picked up the story. The scandal exploded to national proportions, exposing decades of corrupt practices and bringing hundreds of similar cases to light. For Marcus and Malik, it was as if the world they knew was falling apart and being rebuilt at the same time. With each new revelation, with each family reunited, they felt a mixture of grief for what they had lost and hope for what they could gain. A week after Dr. Carter's revelation, the Johnson brothers met again in Sarah Goldstein's office. The atmosphere was different now. There was a sense of completion in the air, mixed with anxious anticipation. "The judge issued the final decision today," Sarah announced, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "The adoption agency will be closed down permanently. Everyone involved in the illegal schemes will be prosecuted. And most importantly," she paused, looking directly at Marcus and Malik, "a federal investigation has been authorized to locate Sarah Thompson." The news was greeted with a mixture of tears and smiles. Evelyn hugged her grandchildren, sobbing with relief and renewed hope. Mary and John, the adoptive parents who had been by their children's side every step of the way, exchanged looks of pride and love. That evening, as the family gathered for a celebratory dinner, Marcus found himself observing the scene around him. His adoptive family, who had raised him with so much love, his biological grandmother, a connection to a past he barely knew, and his brother, Malik, the only constant in a life full of uncertainty. "What are you thinking about?" Malik asked quietly, noticing his brother's distant gaze. Marcus smiled, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. "How lucky we are," he replied. "Despite everything, look how much love we have in our lives." Malik nodded, understanding perfectly. "And now we have a real chance of finding our mother," he added, his voice barely containing the hope. As the evening progressed, filled with laughter, stories, and plans for the future, Marcus and Malik Johnson found themselves at the center of a family that transcended blood ties. A family forged through love, loss, struggle, and finally, acceptance. The road ahead was still uncertain. The search for Sarah Thompson promised to be long and possibly painful. But now, surrounded by those they loved and supported by the truth finally revealed, the brothers felt ready to face any challenge. When they finally retired for the night, exhausted but with full hearts, Marcus and Malik exchanged one last look of mutual understanding. Their journey was far from over, but the most difficult chapter had been completed. The future, once so uncertain, now shone with the promise of new discoveries, healing, and above all, love. And as the stars shone over Boston, silent witnesses to so many stories of loss and redemption, the Johnson brothers fell asleep with a new sense of peace. No matter what tomorrow brought, they would face it together, not just as brothers, but as part of a family that had grown beyond all expectations, united by the transformative power of truth and unconditional love. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to like and subscribe to my channel. Your support motivates me to keep sharing exciting stories nearly every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to unfold on your screen. I greatly appreciate your backing.